Sorry. Just for introduction time, Sabrina speaking first for college prep, just for like speaks and whatnot, comments. Okay, is anybody not ready? Cool. We negate. Our sole contention is one step forward and two steps back. Although America's infrastructure was once deteriorating, recent legislation has brought that to an end. Labosco 21 of CNN finds Congress passed a $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill last summer, the single largest investment in repairing a nation's infrastructure since the interstate highway system. Touching everything from roads to broadband, the bill will reintegrate rural America and substantially increase economic growth. These goals have moved beyond Capitol Hill. The Associated Press found in May that just 6 months in, Biden's infrastructure plan has distributed over $110 billion in funding, with much more on the way. Indeed, this bill is just the beginning. The University of Chicago reports in 2021 that support for additional infrastructure investment is one of the few views broadly shared by both parties. However, politicians aren't interested in enacting two visions at once. Bliss 22 of Bloomberg confirms, with priorities like healthcare and education demanding attention, leaders lack the political capital to reinvent the wheel. Efforts to improve existing infrastructure can't coexist with flashy megaprojects. Fiscal realities demand a prudent approach. Snyder 22 of Political Rights, state officials will only add new projects to their infrastructure plans if they replace existing ones. In the wake of record inflation, there simply isn't enough room in the budget for more. Unfortunately, O'Toole 21 of the Cato Institute finds high-speed rail will require more than $4 trillion in funding, a single mile of track of $200 million, and maintenance requirements include replacement of rails every 10 years. Thus, the dichotomy is simple. Every dollar spent building high-speed rail is a dollar taken away from repairing roads, bridges, and airports. This is not a fair trade. For decades, politicians have claimed high-speed rail to be the future of transport, but these promises fall short of reality. Instead, Bolanos 15 of UC Berkeley explains, governments lose track of long-term economic goals, blinded by short-term political gains. Costs are routinely underestimated, while careful analysis and planning are swiftly swept aside. Indeed, high-speed rail has failed across the board. In Europe, Christian 18 of the Fund for American Studies finds HSR suffers from chronic cost overruns, delays, and poor performance. Lines often run at below 50% capacity with little difference between high-speed rail and ordinary trains. Looking eastward, Shin 22 furthers, China's HSR has added nearly $900 billion to the national debt, causing Desai 21 of the Observer's Research Foundation to conclude projects are facing the chopping block in the wake of low returns. When projects survive, it's not on their merit. Feigenbaum 13 of the Reason Foundation explains that high-speed rails all over the world have been hooked to government life support, with costly subsidization the only reason they remain operational. Here in America, these issues will only be exacerbated. The Cato Institute confirms this in 2009. Our current interstates are 10 times more cost-effective than high-speed rail. Samuelson 10 of RCP confirms, while Europe and Asia have city plans built on public transit, American destinations are too dispersed to support rail service. Such service is unlikely ever to even start. Despite substantial federal funding, Gumbel 22 of The Guardian finds California's HSR has fallen prey to mismanagement, inexperience, and political blunders. Even with 14 years of time, money, and effort, the project has yet to lay a single mile of track. Barriers to building high-speed rail go beyond bureaucracy. McCardle 19 of The Washington Post writes, developing HSR would require the government to seize thousands of miles of valuable real estate. Americans would fiercely fight back. McCardle furthers, the U.S. legal system allows citizens to tap the government for decades in eminent domain appeals that kill once ambitious high-speed rail proposals. Buyer 20 of Governing puts it really simply. High-speed rail cannot be built because there's no legal right-of-way for it. At the end of the day, voting affirmative trades in our current path to prosperity for a useless vanity project that won't be completed and won't be used even if it is. Right now, we can't afford to make that trade. Shaper 21 of NPR concludes, absent effective infrastructure development, the U.S. will lose $10 trillion in economic growth by 2030, with 3 million Americans losing their jobs and millions more bearing the brunt of negative spillovers. Thus, to preserve progress and prosperity, you should reject this trade. You should vote negative. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Can I just see one card?
Yeah.
The uniqueness on that says that you can only have like X amount of projects and there's always a trade.
Replacing the Snyder. Yeah.
Yeah. Should we just come over and read it?
No.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. All right. Hello, Judge. My name is Daniel, and I'm the first speaker for the Palo Alto team, and I'm going to be affirming the resolution. My time will begin on my first word, assuming no one's not ready. All right. Palo Alto affirms. First, if we fund high-speed rail construction, it will be built. Marx 18 writes that the US is the richest country in the world. We could have a 21st century transportation network if we wanted one. GEL 13 furthers the main obstacle to the development of an HSR in the US is funding. It takes substantial financial resources to develop a network that is high speed, efficient, and attractive to travelers. Their other concerns are not relevant here. Funding is the main issue. Our first contention is stopping the spill. A significant portion of American industries and daily life are powered by oil. According to the US HSR, America's dependency on oil is the most severe in the world. We use 25% of the entire world's oil supply, yet we only have 5% of the world's population, and we use 70% of that for transportation. A high-speed rail would decrease dependency due to decreased amounts of cars, because it will help take cars off the roads. In the United States, cars burn 1/4 of all US emissions according to Walker 15, but Bigelow 22 quantifies the Florida HSR project alone could eliminate 3 million car trips per year. Their argument is empirically proven. Haas 14 finds a reduction in car travel in France and Spain, writing that the automobile share travel decreased by an average of 12% after high-speed rail investments in France, Spain, and Germany. And the best available models indicate the same thing would occur in the US. The Center for American Progress estimated in 2010 that a national HSR system could reduce 6 billion pounds of carbon dioxide emissions, equal to removing 1 million cars from the road every year, and it would also decrease plane flights by 500,000. The impact is lives. Bresler 21 finds that every 4,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide cause 1 excess death globally. So any change we make to emissions matters. Any amount of cars we take off the road matters and saves lives. Our second contention is that high-speed rail improves access to housing. Housing supply within the city limits is currently very limited due to restrictive housing policy. Hissei 19 finds that high-productivity cities like New York and San Francisco have adopted stringent restrictions to housing supply, and this lowered aggregate US growth by 36% from 1964 to 2009. This crisis extends nationwide and is getting worse in the status quo. Arnold 22 says, we're seeing a shortage of housing in all corners of the US. Home prices are up more than 30%, making homeownership unaffordable for millions of Americans. But these restrictive zoning laws are unlikely to change anytime soon due to politically powerful anti-housing advocates. But high-speed rail would offer a strong solution. Nicholsburg 19 from Harvard finds that HSR increases the convenience of living in outlying suburbs of crowded and expensive cities, giving people more options and making housing more affordable for people working in those cities. Japan found that the potential of high-speed rail is to add significant residential land to America's fastest growing coastal cities. Therefore, high-speed rail can mitigate many of the harms of the housing crisis. Newman 19 finds that a new data analysis shows that the cost of living in the United States for housing may be a cause of poorer health. They found that every 10% increase in the share of households severely cost-burdened by housing was linked to 29,000 more children living in poverty, 86,000 more people who are food insecure, and 84,000 more children reporting fair or poor health. Finally, contention 3 is a better future. Current manufacturing cannot meet job demand. Wegrage 22 finds that there is currently a labor surplus in the transportation, construction, and mining industries. There are more unemployed workers with experience in their respective industry than there are open jobs, but affirming ensures that supply meets demand. As the US lacks a high-speed rail industry, the development of one could create made-in-the-USA supply chains that support local manufacturing and engineering. This could create economic opportunities for millions. American Sustainable Business Network 20 finds it would create 11 million new jobs, an entirely new manufacturing industry, and thousands of specialty companies, and will revive our economy. That's key to poverty reduction. Gutierrez 07 finds a 1% growth in manufacturing decreases poverty by 5% or 7%, and we wouldn't even need to increase debt to pay for it. Levitz 20 finds that if the IRS fully enforced the existing tax code, we could build national high-speed rail without raising taxes or increasing the debt. And economic strength is the key to recession resilience. Proc 09 finds that opening new railways will fuel our economy through the recessions of the next 50 years, specifically through high-speed rail. And that's key, as BU found in 2013, that a crisis of recession would spread around the world, causing 100 million people to fall into poverty. For these reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I take first?
Yeah.
Do you need any cards?
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, no problem. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about this, like, I guess your first contention on, like, the cars and stuff.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
just confused as to who would take the high-speed rails, because, like, I mean, I live in Oakland. To get to SF, I'm not going to take a train that goes 160 miles per hour. If I want to fly to New York, I'm probably not going to take a train that goes 160 miles per hour.
Yeah, so, I mean, that conveniently
So in what
leaves...
case would people actually take these trains?
Yeah, so that conveniently leaves out the mid-distance travel, which is where high-speed rail actually draws most of its ridership, right? So generally, you can see some HSR that takes short distance trips. I mean, generally, even if you're going a short distance, you want to go faster, and high-speed rail will be low cost. Yeah, sure. So San Francisco to LA, right? That's what the California high-speed rail currently being built is.
How long
Other
would that take?
successful I think it's,
Like,
I think 2 hours about for California high-speed rail is predicted to be.
Sure. Why
In
wouldn't
addition,
I just
between
take a plane?
Boston and New York, where the US already has a high-speed rail, or between Washington and New York.
What high-speed rail line is?
The Acela Express,
That's
which
not
goes
high-speed
about
rail.
160 miles an hour, making it high-speed rail.
We can contest that later.
All right,
But
sure.
No. I'm just like confused. Why would I rather sit on a train for 2 hours when I can sit on a plane for 51 minutes?
Yeah, so generally what we can see is that ignores the security. I don't know if you've ever been to the airport, right? But
Oh,
the
I
main
have.
problem with, okay, I know, but the main problem with flying on a plane is you have to go through security. It's a huge hassle. You have to get to the airport, which is usually far outside the city center, whereas high-speed rail wouldn't really face those issues.
Wait, that doesn't make sense. So you're saying that if I am gonna go to a high-speed rail station, that it's A, gonna be right outside my house and I can just walk, or B, that there's not gonna be any security?
No, I
Because
mean,
there's HSR in other countries. Like, I lived in China for like 3 years. I've been on the HSR for kicks. And there's
Yeah.
definitely security.
Yeah.
This doesn't make any sense.
I think there's security,
It's still
but
a time suck.
okay, so I think what my point is that there's certainly security, but high-speed rail consulting firms have found that overall for mid-distance trips, high-speed rail can equal airplanes even if it doesn't go quite as fast because of things like takeoff and landing times. Security is faster at train stations because they're smaller, and there is less security than airplanes. There's less security required to keep the same amount of safety.
I just don't get about your point about like the distance traveled to the train stations versus
Yeah,
the
so-
airport. Like,
well-
are you gonna expect me to walk to the train station?
No,
Is
generally
it gonna
there's
be 5
one
minutes?
airport in an entire city. It's usually generally very far outside the city because airports are very loud, they have a lot of noise, so they have to be placed outside the city.
Train
Whereas
stations
high-speed
aren't
rail
loud.
can have multiple stations inside a city. If you look at China or other nations in the US,
Like
there's
Shanghai,
generally
Shanghai is huge. San
Yes.
Francisco is tiny.
but there's one station in the city center, there might be multiple stations in the suburbs, and multiple stations in the rural areas. It's much more convenient, there's more stations close to you.
I mean, there's 2 in Shanghai, but that's like a mega city. It's
Okay,
like one
well
of
we
the
can
10,
talk
12
about
10
examples
cities.
all we want. Can I ask you a
Yeah.
question about your case?
Sure.
Yeah, so on the infrastructure bill, right? So let's talk about Europe. So you claim Europe high-speed rail failed because it required subsidies. But did the Europe high-speed rail overall provide economic benefits in the region?
No, I don't think so. And even if we look eastward, we can find that $900 billion. Like China is now $900 billion in
Okay, but the
because
point
of
is that
high-speed rails. Like lines are canceled. Like costs they're pretty expensive, and lines are run at below 50% capacity. Nobody takes these trains
Would you
whether
disagree?
living in Europe or whether they're living in Asia. They're just not a good idea. Period.
Thank you.
all right.
Okay, so I'm willing for speaking second for college recommendation, and the order for this speech is going to be an overarching response that frames all the arguments in this round, and then moving on to address all my opponent's arguments individually. Okay, is anyone not ready?
Huh? Yeah.
Okay, perfect. This round shouldn't necessarily be focused on the benefits of high-speed rail, but rather the opportunity cost of investing into high-speed rail over all of our other current infrastructure. My opponents just say that if we funded high-speed rail, we would magically be able to build one, but this argument is actually incredibly flawed for 3 major reasons. The first one is even if we give it more funding, there's still things like bureaucracy and frivolous environmental reviews, etc., which means that even if it has money, they can't actually comply with any of the regulations to build it. The second reason is because our evidence from the US Department of Transportation finds that there are growing retirements throughout the rail sector, which has resulted in a shrinking pool of experts, including engineers, planners, and managers. My opponents try to say that we have a lot of workers that are able to build high-speed rail right now, but their evidence is not specific to the rail industry. Ours is. Ours finds that there simply aren't enough workers to build high-speed rail. We have record low unemployment. Additionally, the third major reason is that there's too much public backlash from people like NIMBYs. They do things like complain about the noise and the decline in property values, which is why overall, as per their own argument, it's going to decrease housing values. It means people would be against it. That's why right here in California, the federal government has literally spent decades trying to build high-speed rail, and not a single mile of track has been laid. Additionally, it's why when Obama invested literally billions of dollars into high-speed rail in 2008 during the Recovery Act, nothing happened. All of the money went to corruption and waste, and no high-speed rail was built, disproving their argument about funding. Again, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Even if we fund high-speed rail, we've given California and tons of other states tons of federal funding in the past, and it has never caused any of the things that my opponents talk about. That's why we should prioritize fixing our most basic infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, etc., over investing in some nebulous, flashy mega project that will probably never even get completed. Knowing that, let's move on to my opponent's first argument about oil dependence. One, most of my opponent's evidence is extremely outdated from over a decade ago. Instead, after innovations like fracking, our evidence from 2022 finds the US is actually a net exporter of oil after the war in Ukraine, which disproves the argument about the US being dependent. But secondly, my opponent's evidence is from US HSR, which is an HSR lobbying company with an incentive to over-exaggerate the effects that high-speed rail would have. Instead, our Druce evidence, which is nonpartisan, finds that high-speed rail would actually only reduce oil consumption by 1.2%, which just clearly disproves our argument. But thirdly, our evidence finds that the trains still use oil, right? Even if they're electrified, they still rely on things like fossil fuels and oil, etc., to power them, which means either way we consume oil. And lastly, our Department of Transportation evidence finds that 95% of car trips are less than 30 miles, which you wouldn't use a high-speed rail to do because you could just use a car. It's much more customizable and much easier, which is why in China, 99% of drivers weren't affected by high-speed rail. Let's move on to my opponent's second argument about housing. One, we are making the argument that current infrastructure investment is actually able to alleviate the housing issue. We're investing in things like housing infrastructure, apartment buildings, etc. to resolve the issue. That goes away when you vote for them. Additionally, our evidence finds that commuter rail is actually much more efficient than high-speed rail because it can span tracks around the entire country and is actually better, and it leads to more of the benefits about affordable housing that they talk about than high-speed rail does. But lastly, there's two reasons why high-speed rail would actually worsen the housing problem. One, you have to kick people out of their apartments to build it, which is why plans, for example, in California have done that. And secondly, my opponents are claiming that high-speed rail would be built in rural regions, but our Dong evidence finds that it would actually suck people away and force everyone into cities by providing connections to it, which worsens the housing shortage. And lastly, there's other reasons why housing prices are high. Things like single-family zoning laws, inflation, etc. They aren't addressing the root cause. Moving on to their last argument about manufacturing. One, our Labosco evidence from literally this year finds that the infrastructure bill is already increasing manufacturing by 15 million jobs, which is 5 times more than any jobs that high-speed rail would create. But secondly, they try to make the argument that American manufacturing is going down, but this is outdated because our evidence from the New York Times literally this year finds that manufacturing is at an all-time high because of increasing goods demand. And thirdly, even if there are jobs that are in demand, the benefits don't go to Americans because our CNBC evidence finds that historically China and other foreign countries have just been outsourced to build these high-speed rail projects, meaning they don't increase the American manufacturing industry. And lastly, my opponents don't even get to an impact in time in their case. You shouldn't evaluate it. At the end of the day, wherever we look, China, Japan, Europe, etc., high-speed rail has always been a failure. We shouldn't try it and keep continuing doing the things that have failed in the past. That's why you should invest in our current infrastructure and negate.
All right,
Can I see some?
yeah, you want to see evidence?
Where was it? Oh, New York Times manufacturing all-time high.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah. Oh, it's time for cross.
No, I just want to read.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see.
Anything else?
No.
Cool.
Alright, we're gonna run prep. Time starts.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That was 129. Okay. I'll just start by responding to the allegations against our case, and then I will go on to their case. Okay. Oh, and it'll start with that brief overview that William touched on. Is everybody ready?
Mhm.
Okay. Time starts now. Immediately go to the first three things that William tells you about bureaucracy, about how there's a shrinking pool of experts, and how there's going to be complaints. Realize that none of these responses fundamentally interact with the evidence that Daniel provides you that says that the only obstacle standing in the way of us obtaining a high-speed rail is federal funding. All of those problems, even if they cause minor delays, don't interact with the fact that it will be built. Let's go to our first contention on oil. The first thing they tell you is that the U.S. exports oil, but that misses the point. It's not just about the U.S. being dependent, it's about that the U.S. is dependent on its current mode of transportation is dependent on oil. It's not necessarily about the exports. But then, William makes a crucial concession when he tells you that in California there'd be a 1.2% decrease in oil. While he's going to try to frame that as a small decrease, remember the statistic that Daniel reads you at the bottom of our constructive, that every little bit of oil saved saves a life. Insofar as William has cold conceded that a high-speed rail will actually decrease oil, this is an extremely easy place for you to sign your ballot right away. But then, let's go on to our housing argument. At the bottom of William's overview, he concedes that housing prices will go down. One big implication, it takes out all of his responses, because even if current infrastructure is solving or community morales are better, our evidence, as well as his own concession, indicates that a high-speed rail uniquely decreases prices, which then leads to lower cost burden, which is one of the main drivers of poverty. But then he tells you that we're going to kick people out. That's their eminent domain argument. I'll get to that on their case. The next thing he tells you is that we're going to force people into cities, which does not have a warrant, because logically, if you can suddenly travel from larger distances, you're not forced to live in the city. It's actually the inverse, that you're able to now live outside of cities, which is the crux of our argument. But then, on manufacturing, the first thing, again, he tells you is that manufacturing is at an all-time high, but if you read the next line of his evidence, it literally says that there are lots of job openings in the status quo. And then he tells you that we're going to export, that a lot of this goods are going to be exported, but realize that Biden's infrastructure bill means that we can't export these production, and it has to be made in-house, which is what our evidence indicates is going to revitalize the manufacturing industry, provide 11.6 million jobs, and power us through the next 50 years of recession. Let's go to their first contention on their one step forward, two steps back. First, the most important thing at the top. The idea that the high-speed rail is not ridden in China or Europe is absolutely and unequivocally untrue. In 2021, high-speed rail in China transported over 1.9 billion passengers, an increase of 23.1% compared to the previous year. When Japan's high-speed rail trains carry more than 420,000 passengers on a typical weekday. There is a great market for a high-speed rail. But then, let's go to their first argument on cost. A couple responses. First, realize that that number that they give you is overtly inflated because you don't buy everything up front. Materials and labor will be purchased when necessary, so the costs are actually spread out over a decade or so. We won't see these harms immediately. But then secondly, private investors can subsidize the cost, which further eases the burden on the federal government. Lindsay 21 explains that investors are already looking to develop a high-speed rail in California, Nevada, Texas, Florida, and Maryland, and that once the federal government gets involved, this enables them to carry through, which will moreover lessen the burden on the government. But then, let's go to their next thing, where they tell you that, oh, it was bad in California, and then they read you this eminent domain appeal. One big problem. All of those are state examples. Multich 19 tells you that it usually takes 3 years of permitting and another 4 of construction, but if the federal government gets involved, we can shorten it down to 1 year, no problem. All of their examples are not applicable in state bidding because we are discussing whether the federal government involvement, which our evidence indicates, would absolutely get rid of their problems. But then moreover, on the right of way, Plumer 21 explains that the United States can repurpose existing Amtrak rails instead of building new ones, which means eminent domain is not used, and thus we strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Thank you.
You ready to cross over?
Yeah.
You want to stand or sit?
I'll stand. Cool. Do you mind if I take the first question?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Are you?
Yeah, I'll just wait for you. Okay, perfect. So,
Yeah.
perfect. So let's talk about your argument about oil dependency, right? So we read you the example that, for example, in California, it is only projected to reduce oil demand by 1.9%, right? Or 12 million barrels of oil per day, right?
Sure.
How many barrels of oil does the U.S. use every single day or every year? Either
Sure.
one.
I'm not sure. I'm sure you can answer.
So the
that
US
for me, but
uses-
Can I finish responding to your
The
question?
U.S. uses
Can I
nine.
please finish
Yeah,
responding to
yeah.
your question? Okay. Like we tell you in case, and that's what I point out in my rebuttal, that even if it's a marginal decrease, that's still going to be lives saved. But moreover, if you apply this to a national scale, all of those benefits are just exemplified even more.
Right. So the U.S. uses 19 million barrels of oil every single day. High-speed rail is only projected to reduce it by 12 million every year. So how are you solving for anything at all?
First of all, your example is not applicable because you're just talking about
All right, but it's
California.
1.9% of California. So the percentage, no matter how big the actual size of it is, the
I
percentage.
can say the analysis and warranting one more time if you'd like, but regardless of how much it's going to be decreasing, your concession that it decreases at all gains us full access to our impact, that we're still going to be saving lives in the app world, because remember what Daniel tells you, that every single amount of oil saved translates to lives.
Okay, cool. You can take a question.
Okay, sure. Let's talk about housing. So
Yeah.
you tell me that high-speed rail is going to force people to live in cities.
Well, there's two reasons why high-speed rail would actually worsen the housing problem. One is because in order to build it, you have to kick people out of
I'm
their
talking
land.
about that perspective.
Yeah, the second reason is that when you connect things with high-speed rail, it draws all the resources into the cities, which gentrifies the neighborhoods and results in increasing housing prices, because now there's a lot more connection, access,
Wouldn't you
transportation,
agree
et cetera,
though that if
which can increase housing prices.
Sure, but now if people can now travel, let's say I work in the city,
Yeah.
and right now I'm forced to live in the city because my job is there. If there's a high-speed rail though, and now I can live in an exurb or suburb and still commute to with the same commute time every single day, are you telling me that that's like how that's the inverse is true, right? That I'm being pulled out and that I'm able to now live outside of the city?
One, we would contest the argument that people are going to be able to commute to work with high-speed rail.
I'll give you
For
appearance.
example, 95% of car trips are less than 30 miles, which you wouldn't use a high-speed rail for, because you would literally have to be on it for like 2 minutes, which doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you spend all that time getting to the station only to be on the train for a short amount of time? It's faster and more specialized to use cars. And the second reason is because even if you have empirics, right? Our empirics looks at, for example, we can read you evidence about places like Brazil that have much lower population density and more comparable to the US, and finds it actually worsened housing prices, right? Like
We would love to see that.
all of your examples are places like China, Japan, etc., which have really dense populations, but the US is much more rural, much more spread out, which is why overall, like,
Sure.
your examples aren't necessarily applicable.
Sure.
Cool. I think
Can we
that,
see
yeah,
the
that's
Brazil
fine.
example,
Yeah.
please? Thank you so much.
speech is where we're gonna talk about like the kind of overarching response about like whether HSR will actually get built or not, and then we're gonna move on to our case about infrastructure, that's the neg, and then we're gonna do some impact comparison. So like, well, who should win the round? Whose impacts are more important? What should you be voting on? And then I'm gonna talk a little bit about their case, about like oil, housing, and manufacturing. Perfect. Is anybody not ready? Cool. High-speed rail has built across the board. In places like Europe, Japan, and China, debt has skyrocketed and lines have been canceled. We give you 3 specific reasons why. In the US, they won't work. First is bureaucracy and environmental reviews that make regulations impossible to meet. Second is too much public backlash from people who fear that HSR will cause too much noise and be disruptive. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, we don't have enough rail engineers, planners, and managers. My opponents say that we have a lot of workers in the transportation industry, but this isn't true because it's not specific to the rail sector, specifically the HSR industry, which has seen growing retirements and not enough like expertise. Their only response to this is that if we throw more money at the problem, all the issues will go away. That's false. If we don't have enough workers, it's also literally impossible to comply with the regulations. Funding is irrelevant. That's also why they've conceded that in California, despite 2 decades of already receiving federal funding, the state has yet to lay a single mile of track, and why when Obama funded the HSR in 2008, nothing has changed. Instead, you should prioritize investing in our current infrastructure. Across the country, we depend on infrastructure every single day to get to work, access drinking water, power houses, and so much more. But despite its importance, our infrastructure is crumbling, resulting in maintenance backlogs that cost the economy $200 billion a year if we don't make needed investments. The recent bill was a great step forward, but if we squander trillions of dollars on their plan, that would trade off money and focus with our existing infrastructure plans, putting the nail in the coffin. They make a couple of responses, most of which miss the mark. First, they say that HSR is ridden. Empirically, no. We tell you that empirically in like France and other countries, lines are ridden at below 50% capacity. But even then, it won't be popular in the US, even if it's built. People would rather take planes because it's faster, or they drive because it's easier. But then they say that the costs are spread out. One, our argument isn't about costs, it's about us having not having enough labor and also work on high-speed rails and other infrastructure at the same time, and about distracting politicians, but also like HSR is just still super expensive. Then they say that our arguments are all about states, but A, the states receive money from the federal government, and B, Obama giving California money was an example of federal funding. Here are some reasons why our argument is more important than theirs. One, building current infrastructure projects is a prerequisite to building HSR because in order for it to work, our infrastructure needs to work too. For instance, if our electric grid don't work, there won't be enough electricity to power HSR. Secondly, our shaper evidence indicates that deteriorating infrastructure like power grids costs US $10 trillion eventually, meaning if we don't fix it now, we'll run out of the money in the future to build HSR. On their argument about oil, they say HSR decreases oil, but like no, they're powered by so much electricity, sure, but they don't say that it comes from green tech. It's gonna come from fossil fuels, not clean energy. Also, their evidence is from 2012. Instead, after innovations like fracking, we find that the US is a net exporter of oil rather than an importer, and that we don't have to rely on other countries. Also, their evidence from US HSR has an incentive to exaggerate the effects of high-speed rail. They've conceded that 98.1% of oil doesn't change, and also most people like won't really take the train anyways. Like in China, we found that 99% of drivers aren't accounted for. On housing, they haven't responded to the fact that Biden is increasing housing infrastructure right now, meaning it's not really unique to this plan, but also that they haven't responded to the fact that they don't actually tackle the root cause of housing. On manufacturing, they really can't go for this. I don't have to do much work on that. Like you heard, their impact was over time. They're missing a fundamental piece of their link chain. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me fix this sand real quick. Yeah, y'all just are back.
Alright, hold on.
How much prep do y'all have?
Like, okay. I'm gonna run prep. Time start now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that was 1
Alright.
6. We have 24 seconds remaining.
All right. So I'm going to start the speech by talking about our first contention about oil dependency. Assuming everyone's ready, I'm now going to begin. You can hear me and everybody's ready for me to begin? All right. All right. Judge, I want to start off with the contention about oil. This is the most important place to vote in this round because the opponents lose on what they claim about our oil usage. Our opponents say in their speech that it would decrease, high-speed rail would decrease California's oil usage by 1.2%. They try to say that's small, but in reality, it's huge. Remember, we tell you that every 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide saves a life. 1.2% of the U.S.'s entire carbon emissions, if we apply the California high-speed rail to the entire U.S., is a huge number. It's over 48 million tons. That means that we would be saving 12,000 lives by decreasing America's oil usage 1.2%. And this is huge. They claim this 1.2% number is small, but remember, we emit so much carbon that this is only a tiny amount. And this carbon is extremely important because we need to think of the future generations. That's the most important thing in this round, is to solve for the future generations who are going to be the victim of climate change. And we're going to be dying from the climate change impacts. We outweigh on probability because they concede this, cold concede, that it would decrease the carbon emissions by 1.2%. So there's a 100% chance of probability that high-speed rail is going to decrease by 100%. Now I want to talk about what they miss on whether high-speed rail would be built or not. They completely miss our Multage 21 part, which tells you it's not about federal funding, it's about a federal project. California high-speed rail may have been federal funded, but it was a state project. The state government administered it, the state government led the regulations and led the court battles. But a federal project, the federal government has much more power than the state governments. And this kicks out all of their responses because the federal government's substantial investment would solve. They failed to respond to our two cards, which specifically state that the federal government could speed up the process and eliminate all these bureaucratic and court hurdles. In addition, they claim on their responses, they claim that let's go to their first contention about infrastructure. Their main point here is that the federal government is going to spend so much money on high-speed rail and so much political capital that they won't be able to build other infrastructure projects, and this is devastating. First of all, they concede that the federal infrastructure bill, by its infrastructure bill, spent $3 trillion on infrastructure. We're already solving for this, Judge. We're not going to just spend another $3 trillion on infrastructure when we've already spent so much money on infrastructure. It's not unique. The government, if we don't spend on high-speed rail, the government is not going to spend more on infrastructure. They might spend more on the military, but our opponents haven't told us why that's good. The government is not just going to plunge more money into the same projects that it just spent $3 trillion on. That problem is already solved for. But what high-speed rail provides is unique benefits, such as oil and manufacturing. Judge, they fail to actively respond to our point that manufacturing, the jobs, there are currently not enough jobs in the construction sector, which they don't address. Not planners, but construction workers to construct HSR. This means that it can power us through the recession for the next 50 years, because the construction workers need jobs, and the construction industry is one of the most recession resilient. So if we can provide these construction workers jobs, we can power them through the next 50 years. And that's such an important impact because we're also helping the future generations, which is most important than anything else, more important than their contention about infrastructure, which is already being solved for in the status quo. For these reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Thank you.
You ready for Grant?
Yeah.
Can we take first?
Sure.
Okay, sure.
Started on the first word.
Okay, sure. One sec. That way. Okay, so you talked about like construction jobs and stuff, right? Why is HSR unique to that? Why can't we just build a bunch of new Starbucks or bridges to nowhere or fix roads?
Okay,
Yeah,
well-
so, oh, you want to answer that?
Well, A, we'd be providing jobs for people, but then B, we'd be providing an extremely functional and beneficial thing that would be, that's benefits, like why would we build a bridge to nowhere? That's useless.
Okay, can we build a bunch of Starbucks? I really like coffee.
Okay,
You know
Sure,
that.
but that's not as functional, and we're not gonna be decreasing oil, we're not gonna be decreasing our housing prices. There's a host of benefits
Right, right.
along with that
But
construction.
your argument
In
is just,
addition, it's a shorter term project.
right, but your argument is just that fundamentally building things is good because you need people to build the stuff, which creates jobs.
Yes,
Well,
but our
it's-
argument is
yeah.
high-speed rail would create an entirely new industry,
Yes,
right?
yes.
High-speed rail would create
That's
an
where
entirely
evidence-
new manufacturing sector that would sustain us through the recessions of the next 50 years, and that's what our Prop 9 evidence says exactly.
What's
So the people who manufacture steel for high-speed rail are gonna be
Yeah.
different from the people who manufacture steel.
Isn't that
But
what
for
you,
highways,
isn't that what you
what is
say
That's not what
specifically
we-
about how there's not enough specific to high-speed rail engineers?
Well,
Is that the same
exactly.
logic
That's
you
the
use?
problem, right? Like
No.
currently in the infrastructure sector, even if broadly the U.S. has unemployment, specifically in the rail sector, high-speed rail, there aren't enough workers to meet demand, right? So even if you
They're also
create
not
demand,
qualified enough.
yeah, they're not qualified. There aren't enough engineers, planners, managers,
Who
etc.
actually know how to build HSR
Yeah.
successfully.
Okay.
Like even if we create demand for jobs, there's no
actually just
supply.
no supply.
You don't
There's-
need as many
There's a huge supply of construction workers and manufacturing workers.
Not in the
There's
real
a
sense.
job shortage in the general. Okay.
Just because you can build like a bridge doesn't mean you can build a train, right? Those two are completely different. We're saying that there's specifically like not enough qualified workers in the rail industry, like in like the train industry or whatever.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean there's like, oh, this general
Construction
nationwide
workers are
shortage.
general contractors. There may be a small portion of specialized jobs, but most construction firms are general contractors. They build everything from Starbuckses to high-speed rail to bridges.
But I mean, high-speed, people have less experience building high-speed rail. You need like specialized techniques, but that's fine. You can take the question.
All right, sounds good. Would you like to ask one over here? Sure. So, let's see. Let's talk about this idea of infrastructure. So,
Sure.
why would the federal government spend another $3 trillion on infrastructure when we've already spent so much money on it
Right,
with
it's-
Biden's infrastructure bill? Isn't it already being solved?
No, we're continually investing, right? Like the way federal spending is allocated is it's not like here's $3 trillion to use all at once. They give out the money over a period of time, right? Our argument is that, yeah, you're right that they passed a $3 trillion infrastructure bill, but that money, not all of that money has been distributed. And the argument is that if we invest and waste all this money on high-speed rail, we can't continue giving
spend money on
all of
building
that
like a train service that isn't super effective and people will ride when literally the grids in like say like
Yeah.
Oakland, they don't really work. Like
So-
houses can't turn on the air conditioning sometimes and PG&E calls us and is like, hey, there's gonna be a power outage in an hour, be prepared. Like, how is that gonna power a train?
Yeah, so
We
our
need to fix that
argument,
first.
is that the grid is already being solved for by, well, that's cross, we'll discuss this in the speeches, but the grid is being solved for by the infrastructure bill and the steps.
Okay,
That's all.
it'll just be kind of big picture on the round, starting with the argument about how high-speed rail won't be finished. Really? Just,
Yeah, we're good.
awesome, okay. In order to vote for my opponents, you need to ask yourself two questions. The first question is that whether high-speed rail will be completed. My opponents have conceded that high-speed rail has failed across the board, Europe, China, etc. Lines are being closed and passengers are decreasing. And there are three reasons why specifically in the US this wouldn't happen. The first one is there's too much bureaucracy. Two, there's too much public backlash from people like NIMBYs. And three, there literally are not enough workers in the status quo to build high-speed rail, which disproves their manufacturing argument. They're going to get up here and try to say that we have a labor surplus in the status quo, but that is general. Our evidence is looking at the rail sector specifically and finds there are too little workers. That's also, my opponent's only response to this is that if we just magically throw more money at the problem, it's going to solve these three issues. But again, this is not true. California has received literally billions of dollars in grants from the federal government to build high-speed rail, and when Obama invested literally trillions of dollars in high-speed rail in 2008, nothing happened. Their argument is just more funding will magically fix it, but again, the federal government can't override fundamental things preventing us from building high-speed rail, like a lack of workers and regulations, disproving their entire argument. High-speed rail will never even get constructed, let alone make manufacturing jobs or reduce oil dependency. The only place you can vote for my opponents is their argument about oil use, but ask yourself, can they win on this argument? No, they can't, because my opponents have conceded that high-speed rail is powered by fossil fuels, so regardless, and they've also conceded that it will only reduce oil consumption by 1.2%. Ask yourself, is 1.2% a lot? It's really not. He's going to get up here and try to say it's a lot, but it's not. 98% of the oil still remains. Also, their evidence is from USHSR and HSR Lobbying Company, and our Department of Transportation evidence finds that 95% of people won't take high-speed rail regardless because the distances and it's too inconvenient. Instead, you should prioritize investing in our current infrastructure, which is what we are doing in the world of negation. Their only response to our argument is the government is already spending on infrastructure. That is our entire argument. We're continually investing in infrastructure, but if you build a massive project that saps political capital and money and workers, making it impossible to invest in our current infrastructure, which is way more important, way more profitable, and creates orders of magnitude more jobs than any manufacturing impact. At the end of the day, in every single instance, California, Obama, etc., high-speed rail has failed in every instance. It has never reduced oil consumption or created manufacturing jobs. You should instead prioritize fixing our current infrastructure project, which is what we're advocating for. Thank you, and please negate.
Thank you.
Okay, we have, what is it, 20 something?
Yeah, around there.
I know. Okay.
It's going to start on overview, and then I'll be addressing some of William's questions. Okay. Time starts now. The first two things in his overview about bureaucracy and about public backlash both completely disregard what Daniel and I tell you, that a federal project is fundamentally different from a state project, which means that all of these wait times and all of these delays will be minimal at best. But then on their construction worker point, remember that we've continuously given you evidence to the contrary, that there is a surplus of construction workers, and it's not like a construction worker working on a Starbucks is going to be different from a train. If they're contracted out, it's not like this highly specialized work. But then, let's go over to our case. The round is completely over in the fact that they've continuously conceded this point on oil. William told you that, oh, this 1.2% decrease is small, and he said that I was going to come up here and say it's big, because it is. Remember what Daniel tells you, that there's 12,000 lives that would be saved every year, and that's at their modest estimate. Other countries have seen far better results, with, remember, Daniel and Kay telling you that there was a 12% decrease in Europe, and that projection in the United States would tell you that we're going to take the equivalent of 1 million cars of emissions off the road every single year. Insofar as our opponents have cold conceded that we're going to be decreasing oil, and our scalar impact is that every single decrease in oil matters, and every single decrease in oil leads to a saved life, this is an extremely easy place to sign your ballot. But then, let's go to their infrastructure argument. At the top, there's a lot of problems. First, they never properly respond to the fact that it's private, that private investors would subsidize the cost. Also, their cost would be spread out over decades, so the political capital that they're talking about won't actually be that large, because the cost isn't just going to be that high. But then moreover, remember what Daniel tells you, that the recent infrastructure bill is already solving for all of their infrastructure woes. You're really not voting for anything here. But moreover, remember that the high-speed rail would be a construction project with a lot of benefits. But then, William posed you some questions, I'll do the same. At the end of the day, Judge, your job is to properly evaluate the round and see which side has clear impacts and should win the round. We tell you specifically, by their own concession, that we're saving 12,000 lives a year. They give you this ambiguous thing about saving infrastructure projects that we've refuted. This is a clean AF ballot. Thank you.
Fair round, Joe. And
Very good. All should submit. I'll submit the ballot in 5 to 10 minutes.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.